You have been legally dead for 6 years. Not metaphorically. Legally. There is a death certificate filed in a county records office in Virginia with your name on it and a date and a cause. That reads training accident and a signature from a colonel who shook your hand the same afternoon and told you to choose a new name before Monday. You chose the name David Carr because it was short and forgettable, and because forgettable is a professional asset when your entire operational value depends on not existing. The unit had no official name. It appeared in no budget line that any Congressional Oversight Committee had ever seen. It was funded through a mechanism so layered and deliberately obscure that 3 separate Inspector General investigations over 11 years had each concluded that the relevant expenditures were within acceptable parameters for classified special operations support, which was language designed to mean everything and nothing simultaneously. You were recruited out of a Ranger battalion by a man who spent 40 minutes asking you questions that had nothing to do with combat performance. He asked you about your father. He asked you what you believed happened to people after they died. He asked you whether you had ever done something you knew was wrong because someone you respected had told you it was necessary. You answered honestly because you were 24 and had not yet learned that honest answers in rooms like that one are not invitations to dialogue. They're data points. The work was not what movies taught you to expect. There were no dramatic infiltrations of enemy compounds, no ticking clocks, no moments of heroism that the camera would have lingered on. The work was quiet and procedural and often deeply boring in the specific way that dangerous things are boring when you have done them enough times that the danger has become a background condition rather than an event. You moved through countries that you were not in. You met people who did not know your real name and would not have believed your real biography if you had offered it. You facilitated outcomes. That was the language the unit used. Facilitated outcomes. It was accurate in the same way that saying a surgeon makes incisions is accurate, technically correct, and designed to keep the full picture slightly out of focus. The first facilitated outcome you understood completely was, in your 8th month, a regional politician in a country whose name you're not going to use was scheduled to win an election that would have redirected certain resource extraction contracts away from 3 American corporate interests and toward a Chinese consortium. The election did not happen as scheduled. The politician was arrested 4 days before the vote on corruption charges that had been assembled over the previous 6 weeks by a team you had provided logistical support to without knowing the full purpose of the support. You learned the connection afterward from another unit member who had been in longer and had stopped performing the mental compartmentalization that new members used to keep the operational pieces separate from each other. He told you over dinner in a hotel, restaurant in a city you were not in. He said the way someone says something they have been carrying too long, not as a confession, but as a transfer of weight. You took the weight and said nothing and finished your food and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the hotel bed and thought about the word facilitated until it stopped meaning anything. You ran 23 operations over 6 years across 11 countries. You learned to speak functional Arabic and passable Mandarin. You developed the particular professional intimacy of someone who has been in genuine danger with the same small group of people repeatedly, a closeness that has no civilian equivalent and no name that translates cleanly into ordinary life. The men in your unit were the most competent people you had ever known, and some of them were capable of things that you never fully reconciled with the competence and the closeness, and you stopped trying to reconcile them somewhere around year 4, because reconciliation was a project that required believing the framework was reparable. And by year 4, you had stopped believing that. The operation that ended your career was number 24. The target was a journalist, not in the euphemistic sense, an actual journalist, a 41-year-old woman who worked for a European investigative outlet and had spent 3 years building a documented account of resource extraction contracts, paramilitary financing, and political interference across 5 countries in Central Africa that connected with evidence to the same corporate interests whose contracts you have been protecting since month 8. You were given the file on a Tuesday. You read it twice. You sat with it for 4 hours, and then you did something that was not in the operational playbook and that you had known since month 8 you would eventually do. You sent her a message through a channel that did not connect to anything that could be traced back to the unit. 3 sentences. You told her the operation existed, that she was the target, and that she had 72 hours to reach a jurisdiction where operational execution was structurally complicated. You did not identify yourself. You destroyed the device immediately after. She moved. The operation was aborted due to changed circumstances, which was the language the debrief used. You sat through the debrief and gave answers that were accurate about everything except the 3 sentences, and you were good enough at this by then that nothing in your face or your voice or your body provided any data point that deviated from acceptable parameters. You were stood down 2 weeks later for what your commanding officer described as routine rotation and psychological evaluation. You understood what routine meant in that context. You had used that word yourself. You did not wait for the evaluation. You had a bag prepared that contained 3 identities, enough currency in 4 denominations to operate for 18 months, 2 encrypted drives, and a photograph that you will not describe here because it is the one piece of the former life that you kept, and it belongs to you in a way that nothing about this account does. You left the safe house at 4 in the morning. You did not say goodbye to anyone because goodbye requires a name, and you had not had one that was yours for 6 years. You moved through 4 countries in 11 days, using routes that you knew because you had designed interdiction operations along them and therefore understood exactly where the gaps were. The journalist published her investigation 8 months later. It ran in 4 languages simultaneously and was accompanied by a document cache that she had clearly supplemented with sources beyond her original 3 years of research. You read it on a laptop in a rented room in a city that does not need to be named, and you looked for the shape of your 3 sentences in the way the story was structured and found it in the section that dealt with the aborted operation in month 24, described only as a confirmed operational target who received advance warning from an unidentified source and relocated before execution. You were a footnote, an unidentified source, a gap in the record that the story acknowledged without being able to fill. You thought that was probably the most honest summary of the last 7 years that anyone was going to produce, and that there were worse ways to exist in the historical record than as a gap that pointed towards something true. You closed the laptop. Outside the window, a city was doing what cities do, which is continuing without reference to anything that happened inside the rented room. And you watched it for a long time before you decided what to do next, which is a decision that this account is not going to tell you because it is the first decision in 7 years that belonged entirely to you and some things you keep